What if everything you believe about yourself is just a story, and letting go of it is the key to real freedom? Carl Jung spent his life exploring the psyche, only to discover that a 2.500-year-old Buddhist teaching might undo it all. Two men, centuries apart, reached the same profound truth: to truly heal, you must lose who you think you are. What if everything you believed about yourself simply wasn't real? In a quiet study in Switzerland, during the shadowed days of 1939, Carl Jung, already a towering figure in psychology, scribbled words that would quietly ignite a philosophical fire. After decades of treating patients and plumbing the depths of the human psyche, Jung stumbled upon a truth so ancient and radical it shook even him. A 2.500-year-old teaching from the Buddha suggesting that the very self he had spent his life studying might not exist at all. But rather than reject it, Jung leaned in. He called Buddhism the most sensible and most direct of all religions. Why would a mind trained in Western science be so drawn to the teachings of the East? And more importantly, what happens when Jung's theory of the self collides with Buddhism's core insight, that the self is merely an illusion? That tension, between two extraordinary visions of human consciousness, may hold the key to a deeper understanding of who we are. Hi. Before we dive into this profound psychological and spiritual paradox, let's take a step back in time. Picture two moments. First, under the Bodhi tree in ancient India, where Siddhartha Gautama, through stillness and clarity, awakened to the radical truth of no self, that the enduring I we cling to is nothing more than a construct, a mirage. This insight would go on to form the heart of Buddhist philosophy. Now fast forward to the early 20th century. Carl Jung sits in his study, surrounded by ancient Eastern manuscripts. He's refining his groundbreaking model of the psyche, one that places the self at the center of wholeness and healing. On the surface, his view seems like the exact opposite of the Buddha's. And yet, here's where it gets truly fascinating: both are right. Both Jung and Buddha uncovered paths to inner peace and healing. Both are supported today by science and lived experience. So how can two seemingly opposite ideas be true at the same time? In this video, we'll explore how Jung and the Buddha reached their revolutionary insights, the real meaning behind self and no self, and the surprising ways their visions don't contradict, but complete each other. This isn't just philosophy. It's a lens that could change how you live your life. To begin our journey, we travel back to 19th century Germany, where a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer first introduced Buddhist ideas to Western thought. His bold writings captivated a young Jung, especially his reflections on suffering, confusion, and the shadow side of human nature. Later, in 1909, Jung met Richard Wilhelm, the brilliant translator of Chinese classics. Through this pivotal friendship, Jung gained unprecedented access to Eastern wisdom. That encounter would mark a defining turn in his lifelong quest to understand the soul. And that's where our story begins. To truly grasp how Jung's ideas evolved, we must remember where we left off: a young Carl Jung, deeply intrigued by Eastern wisdom, had just begun his transformative relationship with Buddhist thought, guided first by Schopenhauer, and later by his friendship with Richard Wilhelm. What followed was not a brief intellectual flirtation, but a full immersion. Between 1909 and 1914, Jung devoted himself to the study of Eastern texts. Each morning, for 3 uninterrupted hours, he sat in his study, deciphering Sanskrit. These weren't casual readings. His letters from this period reveal a growing captivation with Buddhist principles, especially their uncanny resonance with the inner lives of his patients. By 1920, his dedication bore fruit. Jung had amassed one of the most extensive private collections of Buddhist literature in Europe, including rare Tibetan manuscripts that few in the West had even seen. While Jung was building this library of the mind, a different awakening, centuries earlier and a continent away, had already changed the course of spiritual history. 25 centuries before, in the lush Gangetic plain of ancient India, a royal seeker named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath the Bodhi tree. After years of relentless searching, his breakthrough came not from theory but from profound, first-hand realization. His insight into no-self, known in Buddhist terms as anatta, wasn't merely philosophical. It was experiential, born in stillness and internal clarity. In the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, Siddhartha, now the Buddha, declared this radical truth, that there is no permanent, unchanging self. This moment, dated around 485 BCE, marked his enlightenment. Within weeks, he gave his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, at Sarnath, laying the cornerstone of Buddhist wisdom. 5 years later, he articulated the full teaching of anatta in Varanasi, planting the seeds of a psychological revolution that would echo across centuries. During Jung's own lifetime, the currents of East and West began to mix at an unprecedented pace. Steamships, telegraphs, and global trade forged new connections, making Buddhist texts accessible in ways never seen before. Jung's home in Kusnacht became a treasure trove, stacked with Pali and Sanskrit translations, Eastern commentaries, and sacred treatises. But he wasn't just collecting ideas, he was testing them in practice. In his clinical work, Jung noticed something remarkable: recurring inner patterns in his patients that eerily aligned with Buddhist models of consciousness. In his 1925 clinical notes, he began to document this convergence. It wasn't accidental. Both Jung and the Buddha, separated by millennia and culture, were tackling the same essential questions. Why do we suffer? And what gives rise to this suffering? Their tools were different: psychoanalysis for Jung, meditation for the Buddha. But the insights they uncovered began to harmonize in unexpected ways. Even more striking was how Jung's own psychological breakdown, recorded in his haunting Red Book, mirrored the Buddha's own dark night of the soul. Both men passed through the fire of inner chaos, and emerged with truths that reshaped how humanity could view itself. Still, the language they used was shaped by their worlds. While the Buddha spoke in terms of dharma and dependent origination, Jung translated similar insights into archetypes and the collective unconscious. The difference in vocabulary sometimes conceals how deeply their understandings overlap. But what did Jung actually mean by the self? In his seminal work Ion, published in 1951, he defined it not just as the center of the personality, but as something far more expansive. As he wrote, The self is not only the center but also the whole circumference, a concept that, intriguingly, echoes Buddhist ideas of unity beyond ego. In our last section, we explored how Jung's definition of the self wasn't just psychological. It echoed the spiritual depth found in Buddhist teachings. Both Jung and the Buddha sought to understand the nature of the self, but arrived there through different lenses. Now, let's dive deeper into how Jung's evolving concept of the self began to mirror one of Buddhism's most profound ideas. Jung envisioned the self as something far greater than our conscious ego. It was the center of the total personality, encompassing not only what we're aware of, but also what lies hidden in the unconscious. Just as the ego is the center of consciousness, the self integrates the full scope of our being, both seen and unseen. To Jung, the ego, our everyday identity, was just the tip of a vast psychological iceberg. Below the surface lay not only repressed memories and forgotten experiences, but something far more mysterious, a collective unconscious. Through years of working with patients, Jung discovered recurring archetypes, universal patterns and symbols that appeared across cultures and time periods. These weren't learned, they were inherited, imprinted deep within the psyche of all human beings. His personal journals reveal countless moments of synchronicity between modern psychology and ancient spiritual imagery. One striking example involved patients who, without any prior knowledge of Eastern spirituality, spontaneously drew mandalas, circular diagrams symbolic of unity and wholeness. Jung instantly recognized these symbols as unconscious expressions of the self. In one remarkable case, a businessman dreamed of a glowing crystal buried at the bottom of a deep well. Jung was stunned, despite the man's complete unfamiliarity with Eastern teachings. He had dreamt of what Buddhist texts call the diamond body, a radiant symbol of the awakened self. Could the human mind, left to its own inner journey, rediscover truths already etched in ancient wisdom? Yet for Jung, the self was never a fixed entity. In his writings on psychology and alchemy, he described it as a living process, a journey toward inner wholeness. He called this process individuation, the integration of unconscious elements into our conscious awareness. Through careful observation, Jung noticed that individuation followed recognizable stages. First, patients had to confront their shadow, the denied or hidden parts of themselves. Then came an encounter with the anima or animus, the inner feminine or masculine archetype. Finally, if they continued the path, they reached what Jung called self-realization, a state of profound integration. Strikingly similar to the Buddhist notion of enlightenment, his theories weren't formed in isolation. Jung studied mythology, religious traditions, and alchemical texts to support his insights. He documented thousands of dreams and visions, many pointing to a radiant center surrounded by darkness, a symbol seen in Tibetan mandalas as well. Again, many patients had never encountered such imagery consciously. To Jung, the self was both origin and destination, the spark and the wholeness it sought to become. As he wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, this divine center held all things in unity, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, good and evil, spirit and matter. His later writings grew even more nuanced, inching closer to Buddhist thought. In his foreword to D.T. Suzuki's work, Jung openly acknowledged the radical power of the Buddhist teaching of anatta, the doctrine of no self. In the Anattalakkhana Sutta, the Buddha's second discourse after enlightenment, he boldly challenged the ancient Indian belief in a permanent soul. Modern scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi emphasizes that anatta is not mere philosophical speculation, it's a method. A strategy for seeing through the illusion of a fixed identity, and letting go of all attachment. This interpretation, grounded in both classical texts and modern perspectives, helps reveal just how revolutionary the teaching was. But to truly grasp it, we must first understand what the Buddha meant by self. In ancient India, the Vedic tradition taught of an eternal essence, the Atman. The Buddha's insight directly confronted that view, not through debate, but from deep personal experience. Through meditation, not abstract reasoning, the Buddha uncovered a profound truth. Human existence is not grounded in a solid, permanent identity. Instead, it's a dynamic, ever-changing stream of experience with no unshakable center. But how did he guide others to see this? With characteristic clarity, the Buddha used a practical and accessible framework, the 5 aggregates, or skandhas: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These, he taught, are the building blocks of experience, and when we examine them closely, something remarkable happens. We discover that none of them, alone or together, constitute a permanent self. To make this clearer, the Buddha often used a striking analogy: a chariot. If you take apart a chariot into its axle, wheels, reins, and frame, you'll search in vain for its essence. Where is the chariotness? It turns out to be just a label, a convenient name we assign to a collection of parts functioning together. In the same way, what we call the self is just a mental shorthand for a bundle of ever-changing processes. This idea is beautifully captured in the Milindapanya, an ancient Buddhist dialogue. When King Milinda asks the monk Nagasena for his name, the monk replies, "Nagasena is just a designation, a term, a concept, a name. There is no permanent person here. It's not just poetic, it's precise." This simple exchange mirrors the heart of the Buddha's teaching on no self. Another vivid metaphor comes from the Visuddhimagga, a foundational Buddhist text. It compares existence to a burning lamp. Each flame seems continuous, yet it constantly changes, moment to moment. It is never the same, yet the illusion of constancy remains. The text states, "The being of the present moment lives, but does not proceed to the next moment." In other words, continuity does not require permanence. Crucially, the Buddha never claimed that there is no self. Why? Because doing so would simply replace one rigid belief with another. Instead, he invited us to look deeply and see for ourselves. And when we do, we find that what we take to be a self simply cannot be located, not in the body, not in the mind, not even in our memories. This shift in understanding is recorded in the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha emphasizes the transformative power of seeing things as they truly are. The Dhammapada echoes this insight. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Rather than feel despair at this truth, we are offered liberation. Imagine no longer having to defend or preserve a fixed identity. How freeing would that be? This insight is echoed across Buddhist traditions. Zen masters ask, "What was your original face before your parents were born?" Tibetan teachings challenge students to inquire, "Who is it that thinks?" These aren't riddles for the intellect, they're doorways to direct experience, beyond the illusion of self. Yet, as profound as these teachings are, the Buddha was always practical. His goal wasn't metaphysics, it was freedom from suffering. And the teaching of no self leads us there. When we stop clinging to a fictional I, we stop resisting the natural flow of life. We see clearly, act wisely, and live with ease. The illusion fades, and what remains is simply this moment, unfiltered, undistorted, and deeply alive. By learning to see through the illusion of a fixed self, we naturally begin to open our hearts. Compassion emerges, not from obligation, but from recognition. We realize that all beings are caught in the same dance of impermanence, clinging to identities that shift like shadows on water. Importantly, this insight doesn't erase our sense of self, it just places it in context. It reveals that our identity, while useful, is a construction, and in that awareness, we find freedom. At first glance, Jung's idea of the self seems to stand in sharp contrast to the Buddha's teaching of no self. How can a concept that emphasizes wholeness and identity possibly align with a teaching that challenges the very idea of an enduring self? Yet as we peer more deeply, something surprising unfolds. In his later writings, Jung began to acknowledge this convergence. He described the self not merely as the conscious ego, but as a unifying principle, a center of psychological potential that, paradoxically, contains both fullness and emptiness. It is, in Jung's words, everything and nothing, an idea not far removed from Buddhist notions of emptiness and interdependence. This paradox becomes clearer when viewed through Jung's clinical work. As his patients moved toward what he called self-realization, their rigid ego structures didn't strengthen, they softened. In his personal notes from 1938, he observed that such profound experiences of the self often led to a dissolution of the identity they had long assumed to be real. Isn't that strikingly similar to the Buddha's insight? Indeed, both traditions, Jung's psychology and the Buddha's teachings, ultimately guide us to the same door, the realization that liberation comes not from building up the self, but from loosening its grip. Their vocabularies may differ. One speaks of archetypes and individuation, the other of dharma and anatta, but they both illuminate a path beyond the tyranny of the ego. Jung saw the ego as a gateway, a necessary structure, but not the final destination. Just as the Buddha acknowledged the utility of conventional identity, Jung understood that the ego helps us function in daily life. Yet both insisted that real transformation begins when we learn to see through it, rather than cling to it. This shared vision becomes even more profound when we examine Jung's fascination with Tibetan Buddhism. The Tibetan Book of the Dead captivated him. He wrote extensively about its psychological insights, noting how its descriptions of consciousness dissolving into clear light matched what his patients experienced during deep moments of ego disintegration. In fact, Jung suggested that what Buddhism calls emptiness might be understood in the West as the ultimate ground of psychic reality, a state that reveals itself only when we stop chasing identity. One of the most powerful examples comes from Jung's own journey. During his intense inner exploration, chronicled in the Red Book, he experienced moments where his ordinary self vanished completely. What remained was what he called the pleroma, a vast, boundless state beyond all dualities. Both traditions, Jung's and the Buddha's, point to this same truth, that suffering arises from clinging to a limited self. Where Buddhism boldly declares the self an illusion, Jung gently guides us through its architecture, helping us dismantle it from within, and in doing so, both offer us a glimpse of something beyond the self, something luminous, spacious, and deeply human. Jung's process of individuation leads to a fascinating paradox. The more one becomes truly oneself, the more one touches something universal, something that transcends personal boundaries. It's as if discovering our deepest individuality opens the door to a shared essence of being. Similarly, for the Buddha, suffering arises when we cling, whether to fleeting experiences or to the illusion of a fixed self. Jung noticed a striking pattern in his patients. Much of their psychological suffering came from an inability to integrate the unconscious. This disconnection often led to fragmented identities and inner conflict. Doesn't that sound a lot like what the Buddha described, dukkha? The fundamental dissatisfaction that stems from misperceiving reality? Both thinkers offered a path forward. For the Buddha, it was the Eightfold Path, a clear, ethical, and meditative guide to liberation. For Jung, it was individuation, the slow and mindful integration of unconscious material into consciousness. Each method, in its own way, resolves inner tension and nurtures a deeper, more harmonious self. Jung's concept of archetypes presents another bridge. These universal forms, like the wise old man, the hero, or the shadow, exist independently of any one individual. They hint at a reality beyond personal ego. Just as the Buddha taught that Dharma, the fundamental law or truth of existence, operates whether or not we recognize it. Could these be two languages pointing to the same truth? Even their therapeutic practices overlap in subtle and fascinating ways. Jung's method of active imagination, engaging consciously with inner images, bears a strong resemblance to certain Buddhist visualization techniques. Both serve the same purpose: to loosen rigid ego structures and allow deeper wisdom to rise from within. After immersing himself in Buddhist texts, Jung confessed, "The East has taught me another, wider, more profound and higher understanding through life." For both men, knowledge wasn't about memorizing facts or clinging to dogma. It had to be lived. It had to be felt. That's why both emphasized direct experience. Jung asserted that intellectual learning alone could never bring transformation. Something must grip the patient, awaken them. Only then could lasting change begin. The Buddha echoed this view. Meditation, mindful awareness, and lived insight were far more powerful than abstract theory. Ultimately, both teachers urge us to face ourselves, not as fixed identities, but as evolving processes. Whether through silent meditation, therapeutic reflection, or simply observing the flow of everyday life, we begin to see the self is not a solid wall, but a flowing stream. This paradox, that we are both everything and nothing, illusion and potential, lies at the heart of transformation. And it's in this space between East and West that something beautiful begins to emerge. In today's world, we see this synthesis come alive in therapeutic settings. One powerful example involves a patient named Sarah. For years, she tried to fix herself. But her real breakthrough came when she stopped striving and started simply observing. As her anxiety softened, she realized something profound. The self she clung to wasn't something to be perfected, it was something to be released. She had discovered what Jung called the self and what the Buddha described as no self. Not by chasing answers, but by letting go. Concrete practices reflect this integration. Jung's dream work, for instance, encourages us to meet dream figures as expressions of the psyche. Layer in Buddhist mindfulness, and suddenly those dream images become even more meaningful. Instead of identifying with them or rejecting them, we observe them curiously, compassionately, until deeper understanding unfolds. Picking up from the deep parallels between Jung's individuation and the Buddhist path of liberation, we now turn toward how these insights unfold in real-life practice, where shadow work meets mindfulness. And transformation becomes not a theory, but a living experience. In contemplative psychotherapy, a powerful blend of Jungian psychology and Buddhist wisdom comes to life. Here, Jung's understanding of the shadow, the repressed and disowned aspects of ourselves, intersects beautifully with Buddhist techniques for working skillfully with difficult emotions. Instead of avoiding pain or labeling parts of ourselves as bad, patients are taught to observe with what's often called spacious awareness. One psychiatrist put it simply yet profoundly: when we stop fighting against parts of ourselves, integration happens naturally. This is where active imagination, a core technique in Jungian therapy, gains new depth when paired with Buddhist insight. Rather than striving to build a more polished or better version of the self, practitioners learn to move fluidly between various facets of the psyche. As one longtime meditator described, "I used to think I had to become someone better. Now I see there's no fixed self to improve, just a living process unfolding." Moment by moment, such an approach offers remarkable support for those wrestling with chronic identity struggles. Jung's developmental map, infused with Buddhist clarity, shows us how suffering often emerges from clinging to rigid self-images. One compelling case tells of a businessman who transformed his workaholism, not by renouncing ambition, but by seeing his drive not as self or not self, but simply as a pattern arising in consciousness. This shift in perception gave him the freedom to relate to his behavior with greater wisdom and less grasping. And it doesn't stop with individual growth. Relationships, too, are enriched by this integration. When couples begin to release their attachment to fixed identities, neither over-identifying with selfhood nor denying their lived reality, they engage more openly, more authentically. A couples therapist observed that partners who internalize both Jungian and Buddhist views argue less about who's right and connect more deeply with each other's essential being. Beyond the therapy room, this fusion is gaining momentum in social and organizational settings. Leadership programs now draw from both traditions to help executives lead with awareness, balancing strength with humility. As one CEO reflected, "Understanding the self as both center and no center paradoxically made me more effective and more human." What began as a philosophical tension Jung's integrated self versus Buddhist teaching of no self has matured into a dynamic, complementary vision, separated by time, yet united in spirit. Their teachings expand our understanding of consciousness and liberation. Jung, near the end of his life, expressed it with striking clarity. The goal of Eastern religious practice is the same as that of Western psychology: the shift of the center of gravity from the ego to the self. Buddha, using poetic imagery, conveyed this same truth. Like a water bubble, like a mirage. One who sees the world this way, he taught, becomes unreachable by death. In the end, both remind us that suffering doesn't arise from having or not having a self, but from how tightly we hold on to it. When we loosen our grip, life softens. Jung called this state wholeness. Buddha named it liberation. Together, like the two wings of a bird, Jung's depth psychology and Buddhist insight help us soar beyond the illusion of separation. The path to freedom isn't in choosing one over the other, but in letting both illuminate the mystery of being. Now, I'll leave you with a question. What lies beyond the story you tell yourself about who you are? Share your reflections in the comments. What moved you? What challenged you? And if you haven't already, join us by subscribing. Let's keep exploring these timeless truths together. Until next time, may your journey be grounded in clarity, courage, and compassion. See you in the next video.